Now let's discuss the acquisition processes. My name, of course, is Lynn Weiss, and I'm your instructor. So the topics that we're going to cover include how you select assets, what do those processes look like, as well as dealing with vendors and selecting vendors based on product, based on certain criteria that is deemed important for the organization, and product selection tools. We're going to talk about the tools that aid the processes in selecting assets. So the acquisition processes, this is where we have to start. How do the assets get into the environment? And this can be very complicated depending on the environment you work in, depending on your organization, how large it is, how spread out it is as far as where are the different business units, how many countries you operate in. But we want to make the right decisions in acquisitions and make them for the right reasons. The right reasons primarily are to benefit the organization. You've got to make sure you look at things such as vendor terminology and make sure that the offerings from the vendor, make sure they're not inconsistent. Because if they are, you're going to have a problem. So you want to standardize when it comes to terms and conditions, things that go in the contract, and what the vendor is offering you versus vendor A versus vendor B. Make sure you have a good understanding of what those are. Also, it requires knowledge of the needs of the business. So this means you're going to have to incorporate others within the decision-making process. I have rarely seen a hardware asset manager be the final say or the complete decision maker when it comes to buying assets. They may be in charge of the budget, they may be the one that sets the order out there, but they aren't necessarily the one that makes the decision. So you're going to have to look at others to help aid you in these processes. So it's important for the hardware asset manager because of the fact that the selection processes establish the framework for the negotiations. What do we hope to accomplish? What are we going to choose? What are the hot buttons for the organization? And only with a good understanding of those hot buttons or those pain points or the needs versus what would be nice to haves, will you be able to establish that framework and accomplish the negotiations process the way you want with the outcome the way you want it to be. And obviously the end result is going to be that win-win or a long-term relationship that you can manage with the vendor. So when it comes to looking at the vendors within the organization, you're going to be looking at a variety of different vendors, which includes primarily going directly to the manufacturer if you're buying directly from a Dell or a Lenovo or another organization. Potentially resellers. There are a couple of very large resellers here in the US that offer a variety of not just products but services. And I'm sure there are many others that exist within the countries that you operate in that can help support you and form the supply chain that you need for your hardware assets. You've potentially got leasing organizations or lessors that may lease the assets for you as well. So you have to look at what are your requirements there, as well as what about end of life? Those same vendors that you bought from are not necessarily going to be the same vendors that you use when you dispose of the assets, because in hardware asset management, contrary to software, you actually own the asset. It's yours to do with as you please. Within software, you don't necessarily own it, you're given a right to use, so the rules are different. But in hardware, you can dispose of those assets. And if you do it properly, you've got to deal with potentially that other set of vendors. And then, of course, you have service or auxiliary staffing, suppliers, etc., based on type of hardware or type of service that you're getting, whether it's an outsourcer and they're servicing or they're deploying all your hardware for you. There are a number of others that you can look to for product and service. So there's a pretty long list there of vendor types that you potentially could be dealing with within your organization. So IT technology is just part of every function when you consider it within the organization. And the hardware role may be as simple as updating ITAM processes, but that's not necessarily true in all cases. You may have an expanded role. You may be the acquisitions manager, as we define that role. You may be the person that facilitates buying the assets. You may also be the person or role that defines how the assets are going to be identified within the organization. You may be the driving force behind the acquisition process, or the driving force behind establishing some sort of standardization and customization and centralization within the acquisition processes. So one of the tools that typically is used for acquiring assets, we have a few of them on the upcoming slides. This is the first, which is a request for information, the RFI. It's typically investigatory. It's used to build the business case for buying. It's not typically funded, but it's typically used to segregate those vendors that you want to bring on to the next phase, which would be the RFP, the request for proposal, or those that you want to consider for actually buying. Now, looking at it from the standpoint that I did many years ago, which was as a vendor, I absolutely hated having to respond to RFIs because you didn't know if they were funded, but you did know that if you didn't do it, you may not be able to go on to the next level, which would be the actual request for proposal. You wouldn't be considered for that. So basically, you felt that you were doing the homework of the consumer by responding to the RFI. They can be a painstaking process, and vendors typically don't like them. They're typically sent out to a broad spectrum, a very large audience. It's kind of like an open invitation. Show me your wares, so to speak. And they're restricted in length and depth, and there are specific questions that you ask in order to evaluate that vendor's competence in fulfilling the needs of the organization. So from a user perspective, it's a great tool if you use it, but with the advances in the internet and everything else that's out there, this isn't used nearly as much as it used to be, say, 10, 15 years ago. So looking at it in detail, maybe developed and assessed by a selection committee or a single resource. Typically, an RFI is put together, but in this particular case, you're going to need input from others typically to create an RFI. It could be an actually funded project, but it may not even exist. The vendor doesn't know, and this may be what some people call a fishing expedition, meaning you're trying to hook someone into fulfilling the needs of the organization. So you've got to look at it from the standpoint of, from a business perspective, is creating an RFI, is using an RFI advantageous for the organization? If that's the case, if it is advantageous to the organization, the conclusion should mean that you create your short list of vendors, and therefore you're going to go to the next step, which will be this, the RFP, the request for proposal. An RFP is sent to that select number of vendors. Sometimes after an RFI, sometimes it's the first step. It depends on your corporate culture. It depends on what you do typically. It can be a lengthy document. It could include things such as product and service components. So therefore, you will need to have documents such as a non-disclosure created to make sure that if you have to discuss and educate the vendor on what the needs are for the organization, you will have no problems in doing that because they have agreed not to disclose proprietary or company confidential information. So also you would have some sample terms and conditions and things in there that the vendor would have to agree to in order to do business with your organization. There is also a significant amount of time and commitment on both the side of the organization and the side of the vendor in order to respond to an RFP. This is not a simple task. So it takes a lot of investigation back and forth in order to prepare one and in order to respond to one. So treat both sides of the equation with respect when it comes to an RFP. There should be a selection committee assigned to look at the RFP results. They will review the RFP, review the process, and submit their recommendations as to who would be or should be the vendor of choice based on their view of the world. This should represent a funded project, and the final intent here is to purchase. This is what an RFP is for. There should be funding for it, and you should be ready to move forward. And obviously, the ultimate or the end result, the end game here is to select a vendor. So looking further on, there are a couple of additional documents that may be used based on need within the organization. They could be the RFB, which is request for bid, or RFQ, which is request for quotation. These are typically used in areas where they're commodity type purchases. And in hardware asset management, this can happen quite often when you're buying desktops, when you're buying laptops, when you're buying smartphones, etc. They can be treated as commodity type items. Because when you think about it, when you buy a laptop, you can go to any one of, say, 4 or 5 different vendors and reasonably get the same type of device. It'll just have a little different look and feel, and it depends on your past in dealing with the vendor or dealing with that device type as to whether you choose them or not. Also, make sure, the same as with an RFP, that these processes are funded so that the end result is a purchase. The purpose to obtain the best price with fewer issues is really the deal here. That's why I call it a commodity type purchase, because you don't want complex terms and conditions surrounding this type of purchase. You want to go out, buy it, and be done. It may be sent to a select number of vendors or a broad audience, depending on where you are within your environment and within your selection process. If you want to look for a new vendor, you may send it to a variety. If you want to stick with a particular box, shall we say, you may select a refined list of vendors to choose from. And things such as reverse auctions using eBay or some other auction site could give you similar results, but you have to use those cautiously, because you've got to be concerned about things such as shipping, you've got to be concerned about security of those assets, you've got to be concerned about what terms and conditions are in those contracts, and sometimes buying from things like eBay, you don't have a chance to consider those types of things like terms and conditions before you actually do the purchase. So I'd be very cautious in incorporating that as a business strategy for buying any IT whatsoever, hardware or software. So what's your role within the grand scheme of things when it comes to buying hardware? The first thing you want to do is, like I said, you're the subject matter expert, so you want to build a list of those questions that need to be incorporated into the selection process, such as, how does this fit into the current asset management practices? Can we find these assets if we put them on our network? Do they meet the standards that we have defined? Can we leverage this into a global agreement? Have we done business with this vendor before and we can capitalize on that experience and expand upon it to get better pricing? And then how about things such as, are all the costs adequately represented in the proposal? Do we have all of the specialty terms and conditions identified that we need in order to protect the organization in doing business with that vendor? So you are going to be the role that bridges the gap between the technical evaluators, the IT folks themselves, the financial side, and the end user. You're going to be bringing all those components together and coming up with a concise view of what needs to be done and how it's going to happen. You're also responsible for changes within any ITAM processes or practices or even policies if in fact this asset requires that you change the policies, such as you're now going to incorporate BYOD, bring your own device. And therefore you have to change the usage policies within the organization as to how people can or should use devices, and require that you have a mobile device management solution put onto those devices, for example. And use the knowledge gained in previous acquisitions or in acquisitions previously with this particular vendor to improve upon the current agreement or the next agreement. So learn from, whether you want to call it your mistakes or your stumblings, or just learn from what you've done in the past in order to get a better agreement going on into the future. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you can join me for the next module.